My name is Abigail Monroe. I'm 32 years old. At my birthday party, my sister handed me a sealed bag. The colonel said quietly, just loud enough for a few to hear, "That's not a gift." I stood there in a room lit by candles and scattered with uneasy laughter. No one knew what was inside that bag. No one knew. But they will. Because this isn't the first time I've been underestimated, but it might be the last. Come with me. To learn who I became, someone they never imagined, and to see what happened to the one who thought I was nothing more than a shadow behind my sister. The music was soft enough that I could hear the faint clink of ice in a glass across the room. A slow jazz tune curled through the air, bending around the voices that dipped and rose in polite conversation. The candles on the cake still burned their wicks, bending under the weight of melting wax, and someone, maybe my cousin, laughed too loudly at a joke that couldn't have been that funny. I didn't move. The bag felt heavier in my hands than it should have. My fingers brushed over the seam of the seal, feeling the ridge where it had been pressed closed. It was the kind of closure you didn't undo lightly. Across from me, my sister was smiling in that way she did when she thought she'd done something clever, though her eyes shifted quickly toward the colonel after his remark. She didn't ask him what he meant. No one did. The colonel himself was unhurried. He stood with the ease of a man used to being listened to without raising his voice, his gaze sweeping over the room once before returning to me. I could feel the weight of that look, not probing, not accusing, but carrying something I recognized and couldn't name aloud. I didn't reply. My mouth stayed closed, the faintest curl at the corner of my lips passing for an acknowledgement. The conversation around us resumed in that awkward, patchy way people have when they aren't sure what's just happened. A woman in a red dress poured herself another drink. Someone near the fireplace shifted their stance. I caught the faint scent of pine from the garland draped over the mantel. The bag was still there between my hands, and for a moment I thought of setting it down, letting it rest on the table next to the cake. But I didn't. My grip tightened almost imperceptibly. My sister said something about how Abigail always loves surprises, and a few heads nodded. I let the comment pass. From the corner of my eye, I noticed a man in a navy suit glance between me and the colonel, then quickly look away when he realized I'd seen him. His expression had shifted not much, but enough. There was an understanding there, like a half-forgotten recognition surfacing for just a second before he smoothed it away. No one asked me to open the bag. No one offered to take it from me. In fact, they seemed to orbit around it, careful not to get too close to whatever it might contain. The air felt subtly different, as though the room had been tilted a few degrees, and everyone was leaning without realizing it. I kept my posture easy, my breathing steady, my expression neutral. But under the surface, something moved. Not anger, not even hurt. It was quieter than that, something older, slower, like the first stir of wind before a weather change you can't yet see. I glanced toward the window. Outside, the evening had deepened into that particular blue that swallows the edges of things, softening their shapes. Streetlights had begun to glow, halos forming in the chill air. For a moment I thought about how strange it was to be standing here in this house, with these people holding this sealed bag. The colonel turned away as if the moment had passed and began speaking to someone else about something inconsequential. But I could tell, even from the way his shoulders were angled, that his attention hadn't left me entirely. He was waiting. Not for me to speak, I knew he wouldn't expect that, but for the inevitable moment when the rest of them would understand. The laughter picked up again, more convincing this time, as though everyone had silently agreed to let the remark drift into the background. My sister drifted toward the drinks table, her heels making small, deliberate clicks against the hardwood floor. I stayed where I was, my hands still around the bag, its weight anchored to me like a promise. It would have been easy to step outside to find some quiet corner and tear the seal open to look at what was inside and put the questions to rest. But not tonight. Not here. There was something about the way the moment had unfolded that told me it was better to wait, to let them wonder. So, I waited. I let the night carry on as it always would, the candles burning lower, the wine bottles emptying the polite goodbyes, and coats shrugged on. And all the while the bag stayed sealed in my hands, its contents untouched. When the last guests were leaving, I caught a final glimpse of the colonel across the room. He didn't nod, didn't smile, but his eyes held mine for just a second longer than necessary. And in that second, I felt the shift inside me settle into place. I knew then that whatever was inside the bag wasn't just for me. It was a message, and the night was far from over. I grew up in a place where the wind never stopped moving. In the summers, it carried the scent of cut hay and the dry rasp of dust across the fields. In the winters, it knifed through layers of wool and denim-finding skin, no matter how you tried to shield it. Our town in eastern Wyoming was the sort of place you could miss if you blinked while driving past a handful of streets, a grain elevator, one diner with cracked vinyl booths. My sister Margaret was 2 years older. From the start, she knew how to be seen. She had the kind of beauty people notice without trying blonde hair that caught the light a laugh that carried. Teachers remembered her. Store clerks asked after her. At church, women leaned down to whisper to their children, "See, that's Margaret Monroe. She's going places." And then there was me. I wasn't shy exactly, but I learned early that it was easier to listen than to compete. I sat in the second row of class, handed in homework on time, and passed through the hallways like a shadow. I didn't resent Margaret. In many ways, she was my ally until she wasn't. In our family, praise was a rare currency, and it was almost always spent on her. When I made the honor roll, my mother would say, "That's nice," before asking Margaret about her next debate tournament. When I was chosen to read at the Christmas service, my father nodded, once, then turned to my sister. "Did you tell them about your scholarship?" I learned to accept it with a half smile, the same one I still wear now when people underestimate me. By the time I was 17, I understood that if I wanted to really matter, I'd have to step outside the frame entirely. The town had its rules, and I didn't fit the picture it wanted to hang on the wall. So I left. I didn't tell many people where I was going. I said college, and that was technically true. What I didn't mention was that the program I entered wasn't just academic. It had another layer one that required early mornings physical drills and the quiet endurance of keeping certain things to yourself. Most people don't notice that kind of work. They see the surface, the uniform maybe, but not the hours you spend wearing down the edges of who you used to be until you fit a role you never imagined for yourself. In those first years away, Margaret and I stayed in touch in a polite, occasional way. She sent me photos of her life evenings and downtown Denver office parties, the new apartment she moved into after her promotion. I sent her fewer photos, and when I did, they were deliberately vague. A view from a hotel window, a street sign in another language, a book half read on a train table. She never asked for details. Back home, my absence became just another fact. At Thanksgiving, my chair was filled by an uncle or a neighbor. At Christmas, my gifts were shipped late or forgotten entirely. I wasn't angry. There was a freedom in being left out. It meant no one was watching closely. But there's a strange thing about invisibility. If you live in it long enough, you start to believe it's the same as insignificance. I carried that doubt with me, tucked into the corners of my thoughts, even as I was trusted with more and more responsibility in the work I had chosen. There was one winter I must have been 26 when I came home unexpectedly. Margaret was hosting a party for a friend's engagement, and she invited me perhaps out of obligation. I arrived just as the first snow began to fall, the streets softening under its weight. Inside the house was warm, crowded with people I didn't know. I remember standing in the kitchen listening to Margaret introduce me to someone as my little sister Abigail. She's doing her own thing, I guess. I smiled as always, but something inside me cooled. It wasn't the words themselves, they were harmless enough. It was the way she said them, as if my life were a vague side project unworthy of explanation. The man nodded politely and the conversation shifted. It happened again and again in different forms. Sometimes it was my father telling a neighbor Margaret's in finance, she's really making a name for herself, while I stood beside them unacknowledged. Other times it was an old classmate saying, "We weren't sure where you ended up. You just sort of disappeared." I let them think so. What they didn't see, what they never asked about, were the years in between the places I'd been, the situations that required more than just showing up. They didn't know about the night in a rain-slick alley where I had to make a decision in less than 5 seconds that would change the course of months to come. They didn't know about the coded phone calls, the maps spread under dim light, the hours spent waiting in stillness for the right moment to move. And they didn't know because I never told them. Keeping that silence was easier than explaining a life they wouldn't understand. But silence comes with a cost. Over time, it can make even your own story feel remote, as if it belongs to someone else entirely. I sometimes wondered if Margaret ever suspected there was more to me than the quiet, unremarkable sister she introduced at parties. If she did, she never let on, and I didn't give her reason to look closer. By the time I turned 30, the distance between us had settled into something like a truce. We spoke on birthdays, exchanged the occasional text, saw each other at family gatherings. I thought it would stay that way, parallel lines that never truly intersect. But life has a way of circling back, folding you into moments you never expected to face again. That's how I found myself 2 years later standing in a candle-lit room on my birthday, Margaret smiling with that familiar mix of confidence and calculation, a sealed bag in my hands, and the Colonel's quiet voice breaking the surface of the evening. I'd thought I had learned to live with being underestimated. I hadn't realized that the story I'd left untold was about to be forced into the light. Trouble never arrives with a drum roll. It comes as a small tilt in the air, the kind that makes you glance at a clock and realize the minute hand has jumped farther than it should. Ours began with a simple change in itinerary. A meeting that moved from noon to dusk, a location shifted 3 blocks south, closer to a square where the evening market would bloom with plastic tarps and yellow bulbs. I remember the way the light fell that day, the city's edges softening as the heat bled out of the pavement. The rhythm of scooters and voices rising like a tide you couldn't wade against. I was supposed to stay invisible. That was the plan. Eyes on the entrance, a narrow alley as my corridor, a wall of ochre paint at my back. My earpiece hummed with the quiet breathing of people I trusted. The Colonel wasn't on the channel, not directly, he rarely was, but his absence had a shape to it, a steadiness that held the net together. Then the signal changed. A man who wasn't supposed to be there appeared at the mouth of the square, wrong jacket, wrong shoes, wrong pace. He moved with the confidence of someone who believed he was playing on home ground. A second voice cut across our comms, clipped unfamiliar. Decisions that were mine and my team's became decisions made elsewhere, the kind that arrive as instructions you don't have time to contest. We adjusted. We always did. The contact we were meant to meet stepped into the light of a stall selling batteries and phone cases blinking against the glare. He raised one hand to scratch his cheek. Our time windows collapsed to seconds. I shifted my position and felt the alley tighten around me, every sound suddenly distinct, a dog shaking its collar, the electric pop of a bulb, a child tugging a sleeve. And then the market folded in on itself. There are a dozen versions of what happened next. I've read some of them. In one, there was an accidental shove that sent a vendor's table tipping. In another, an argument flared between strangers and ignited into something larger. In the report that eventually went upward, it was a spontaneous disturbance. None of those versions mentioned the man in the wrong jacket, the wrong shoes, moving with the right confidence. I didn't run. I stepped forward. The alley unfurled into noise and motion, a wave of bodies, 3 broad shapes against the current, a gap I had calculated in my sleep for months appearing and almost closing. 2 east, 1 north, someone said on the net. Copy. I said, though, I wasn't sure whose instruction it was anymore. There's a point in every plan when all you have left is your training and the quiet part of yourself that does not break. I reached for that quiet. I reached for the simple act of moving one step, then another, until the line between before and after was just a scuff on the floor. We made the handoff. It should have been clean. It wasn't. Later, in a room with air conditioning set too cold, I watched the footage from 3 angles and counted the precise places where things tilted. I saw the hand that should have stayed by a side flicker upward to a collar. I saw the eyeline of a man with a phone drift from the market to our corridor. I saw my own silhouette, smaller than I remembered, slip through a break in the crowd like a needle threading cloth. There was no heroism to it. Just work. But work has consequences. By nightfall, the narrative had hardened not ours, but the one that could survive a briefing. The decision to move the meeting, the appearance of the wrong man, the second voice on the channel, these dissolved like breath against glass. What remained were operational failures with no names attached except mine. My signature was on the plan. I had signed it because I was asked to, because that is what responsibility looks like when it lands in your hands while the clock is running. No one said scapegoat. They didn't need to. The language for it is gentler accountability process review areas for improvement. Meetings filled with faces that had once nodded at me now looked past me. My inbox grew dense with requests for clarifications that had nothing to do with clarity. A file appeared with my name misprinted on the third page, a small error, almost nothing, and was reissued without comment. I kept both copies. It wasn't only the job that shifted. The ripple went outward. A friend stopped returning calls. A colleague who had once left me coffee on late mornings chose a different table in the cafeteria. I understood. People like to be near power even when the power is simply the absence of trouble. At home, the changes were subtler but no less sharp. Margaret texted me a link to an article that said nothing and implied everything followed by a single line. "Are you okay?" I typed deleted typed again, then answered, "I'm fine." She sent back a heart and a balloon. The conversation ended there. In the middle of that week, I was called into a review. The room was colorless and smelled faintly of toner. A committee of 4 sat with legal pads pens aligned across the top edges. They asked questions that sounded like statements, their voices careful not to bruise the air. I responded with facts. I did not defend myself. There is a difference. At one point, the door opened and a man I didn't know stepped in with a folder. He slid it onto the table with a neatness that felt practiced. As he turned to leave, I saw the corner of a coin in his palm, not money, but the heavy minted kind that passes from one set of hands to another without witnesses. He met my eyes longer than an errand required. Then he left. I can tell you the dates, the clocks, the names of the rooms. I can tell you that a captain I had never worked with used my first name and then corrected himself to Ms. Monroe with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I can tell you that the colonel did not appear in any of those meetings. I can also tell you that when the elevator doors slid open one afternoon, he was the only person inside, and he shifted his stance so that when I stepped in, we faced the same way shoulder to shoulder, both looking at the seam where the doors met. Neither of us spoke. I felt steadied anyway. The formal outcome arrived 2 weeks later in a memo that said very little in 3 paragraphs. A line near the end read commendations on hold pending final review. My commendations. Not many people knew about them. The process is slow, the paperwork opaque, the acknowledgments often delayed until the moment has cooled. I had once been told over a net I can still hear in my sleep Monroe that was clean work by a voice with rank in it. There is nothing official about being called by your name at the right moment, and yet it had mattered to me more than any certificate. The memo didn't remove that moment. It just layered silence over it. By then, the story had settled in the places stories like to settle in the pauses between sentences, in the shared glances over inboxes in the angle of a chair pulled slightly away from mine in a briefing room. My job narrowed to the parts that could be done without being seen. I did them. I did them well. The net held because I held it even as my name grew lighter on the roster as if it could be lifted off without leaving a mark. It would have been easy to speak, to gather the 3 or 4 details that would have pierced the membrane of that approved narrative and let the air in. But there is a cost to every victory, and sometimes winning the argument means losing the work. I wasn't willing to lose the work, so I stayed quiet. I filed my reports. I kept my hours. I learned how to nod at rooms that had already decided how to think of me. Outside, the city moved through its season's rain, lifting the dust off sidewalks and laying it down again as if erasing and rewriting the same small sentence. And yet, there were the small proofs that refused to vanish. A sealed envelope with a return address I recognized for what it wasn't. A message in a channel no one admitted existed, a time, a place, the outline of a task meant for someone who could be trusted and not thanked. A stranger at a security desk saying my last name under his breath as if testing the weight of it, then waving me through without looking up. When Margaret called to plan my birthday, "Let me do it this year," she said, breezy certain I agreed. It seemed easier than explaining why I didn't want the attention. The evening came as evenings do, gentle at first, then edged. The colonel arrived later than most greeted. No one loudly took a place against the far wall where the light didn't reach his shoes. And when my sister, bright as a stage, pressed the sealed bag into my hands, and the room tilted by a degree I recognized too well, his voice, low, even undeniable, cut through the practiced warmth. "That's not a gift." People turned toward him, then toward me, as if we shared a secret. We did, though, not the one they thought. It wasn't about what was inside the bag. It was about everything that had been kept outside of rooms until now. I held the bag and let the moment balance. I didn't argue with anyone's version of me. I didn't need to. The quiet had begun to move again, the kind that changes weather you thought would last. There is a point when being underestimated stops being a shield and becomes a fuse. I could feel the heat travel slow and certain to where it needed to go. I said nothing, and for the first time in months, silence felt like a choice. There is a kind of quiet that doesn't come from peace. It's the stillness you find in a waiting room long after your name has been called, when you remain seated because you're not sure if you heard it right. That was the quiet that settled into my days after the birthday. The work kept coming, though less of it seemed to have my name on it. Tasks that once required my signature were reassigned for efficiency. Meetings were rescheduled without me, agendas trimmed until there was nothing left for me to attend. No one told me I was being sidelined. They simply rearranged the furniture until my chair no longer fit. At first, I told myself it was temporary, a rebalancing a season to endure. I had been through worse. But then the hours began to stretch in ways that left too much space for doubt. It's one thing to hold your silence when you're busy. It's another to keep it when the only thing in front of you is a half-finished cup of coffee and the hum of a fluorescent light. Margaret called once in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. She asked if I'd opened the bag yet. I said no. She laughed, not cruelly, but with that same unthinking certainty she'd had all her life. "You're impossible," she said, as though it were a quirk and not a choice. When I asked her why she gave it to me, she said, "Because you never ask for anything. I thought maybe you'd like a surprise." The way she said it made me feel smaller than I had in years. Nights became heavier. I stopped answering some calls, left a few messages from old colleagues unread. Even the colonel's presence, rare as it was, felt like a ghost, a shadow at the end of a hallway that might be him or might be nothing at all. I began to wonder if the bag was just a gesture without meaning, if the look he'd given me that night was something I had imagined into significance. There was a morning when I almost walked away entirely. I was standing in my apartment holding my ID badge, the one with its fading photograph and the clipped lanyard. The thought came so easily I almost didn't notice it. I could just not go. Not today, not tomorrow. I could be someone else by the weekend. And maybe they were right, all the ones who had looked past me, the ones who had defined me by my absence. Maybe I had been a shadow, a placeholder, a name that could be moved off a roster without anyone missing a step. That thought stayed with me longer than it should have. It was still there when I checked my mailbox that afternoon and found an envelope wedged between a catalog and an electricity bill. There was no return address, only my name in block letters I recognized, not from handwriting, but from muscle memory from seeing it printed at the top of briefings and mission outlines. Inside was a single card, no letterhead, no signature, just a date, a time, and a set of coordinates. The kind of message that doesn't come with instructions because you're supposed to already know what to do. My first instinct was to tuck it away, pretend I hadn't seen it, but my hands didn't listen. I read it 3 times, the numbers settling into me like a pulse. The date was 4 days away. In the hours after I found the card, I tried to imagine what it could mean. A reunion, maybe. A follow-up. Or something entirely new. The point wasn't the what, it was the who. Someone had thought of me. Someone had decided I was still worth reaching. That night, I cleared my desk. The act was small, almost domestic, stacking folders, aligning pens, but it felt like the first real movement I'd made in weeks. I pulled out an old field notebook, the one with creases worn deep enough to feel with my eyes closed, and began checking the shorthand codes I hadn't needed in months. My handwriting looked different, sharper maybe, or hungrier. The next morning, I retrieved a sealed case from the back of my closet. Inside, everything was in its place, untouched but ready. I didn't need most of it yet, but opening it reminded me of the weight of certain tools in my hands, the way they could anchor you in a moment when everything else was slipping. I didn't tell anyone about the card. Not Margaret, not the two colleagues who still spoke to me now and then. The coordinates weren't for them, and the silence was part of the work. By the second day, my mind had shifted. I wasn't thinking about leaving anymore. I was thinking about what needed to be done to be ready. My mornings had purpose again, even if it was only to run through mental checklists that no one else could see. On the third night, I dreamed of the market square from the year before, the tarps flapping, the light flickering. But in the dream, I wasn't moving through the crowd. I was standing still, watching others thread the path I had once taken. They didn't see me, and I didn't need them to. When I woke, there was no ache in that thought. 4 days after finding the card, I stood outside a nondescript building 2 towns over. The air was cold enough to sting, the kind of cold that sharpens your focus. I didn't go inside, that wasn't what the card had been for. Instead, I waited at the corner watching as a dark sedan slowed, a window rolled down just far enough for an envelope to appear, and then it was gone. The envelope was heavier than it looked. I didn't open it there. I didn't open it on the drive home either. It sat on the passenger seat, catching the light every time I turned a corner until I parked in my building's garage and slid it into the same drawer as the coordinates card. Something had shifted. Not in them, the people who had been so quick to move past me still would. The shift was in me. A fuse I'd almost let burn out had found new fuel. I wasn't back, not completely, but I was no longer drifting. When I looked at the sealed bag from my birthday still resting on the shelf where I'd left it, I didn't think of the Colonel's words anymore. I thought of the quiet click the sedan's window made as it slid down, the precision of the handoff, the way my own hands had steadied without me willing them to. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind me who I was when I wasn't standing still. And that was all I needed to start moving again. It started with the smallest of adjustments, almost imperceptible to anyone watching. I shifted my mornings earlier by an hour. The extra time wasn't for exercise or coffee. It was for the kind of preparation you don't put on a calendar. Reviewing patterns, reacquainting myself with names and places that had been tucked into the back of my mind like a folded map. The envelope from the sedan stayed unopened for another 2 days deliberately. Not out of hesitation, but to keep myself anchored in patience. When I did open it, I took care not to tear the flap. Inside was a single-page brief stripped down to the essentials: a location, a date, a schematic without labels, and a list of initials. Mine was the second. There was no explanation, no signature, only a watermark in the corner I recognized from years earlier, one I'd seen stamped on documents that never existed in official archives. I didn't call anyone, didn't confirm. That wasn't how this worked. If my name was there, it was meant for me. Over the next week, I began showing up in places I hadn't been in months. Not obvious spots, no familiar offices or cafeterias, but the less noticeable spaces that still formed the veins of the work. A supply depot in the industrial district, a parking structure with its top floor permanently closed to the public, a library whose back door lock required a code that changed every Monday at 600. I said little to anyone I encountered. Most didn't speak either, but their glances lasted just long enough to pass information without words. A raised eyebrow, a shift of weight, a hand brushing the side of a jacket where a badge would be clipped. The work was there waiting. It had simply bypassed the formal channels where my name had been dimmed. One morning, I found myself at an operations floor I hadn't set foot in for nearly a year. The hum of screens, the low voices speaking in strings of numbers, it all came back with the clarity of a song you'd forgotten you knew. A man I didn't know by name but recognized by posture passed me a folder without stopping. Inside were photographs, grainy but precise, along with a note in the margin: confirm structure integrity by 14:00. Direct handoff. No instructions on how to confirm. They trusted I'd know. I did. The rhythm of it returned quickly. Early starts briefings without introductions tasks that disappeared as soon as they were completed. There was no applause, no acknowledgement, but the absence of doubt was its own currency. You don't have to be told you're trusted when the work in your hands could not survive mistrust. One afternoon, I caught a glimpse of the colonel across a concourse. He was moving with a small group, his attention seemingly elsewhere, but I saw the fractional pause when he passed within range. He didn't look at me not directly, but the angle of his head shifted and I knew he'd registered my presence. That was enough. I kept my other life the surface one, as still as possible. Margaret texted me photos from a ski trip. My father left a voicemail about a neighbor's retirement party. I responded in measured intervals, giving them the version of me they expected, steady, unremarkable, politely distant. Beneath that surface, the assignments continued. They weren't the kind you could discuss not even in code, but each one stitched me back into a network I'd thought I'd lost. One required me to verify a shipment against a manifest that didn't match finding the discrepancy without drawing attention to the fact that I'd found it. Another had me walk through a location twice in one day, noting what had changed between morning and evening. None of it was glamorous. That wasn't the point. The point was precision and the quiet kind of leadership that doesn't involve titles or public credit. You lead by ensuring the people beside you can move without hesitation. You lead by holding the line when no one's looking. 2 weeks in, I was called without warning into a small, windowless room I'd never seen before. Inside a single chair and a metal table with a tablet set neatly in the center. The man who entered after me wore no insignia, but the air around him carried rank. He tapped the screen once, bringing up a set of images and schematics, then slid it toward me. "Walk me through it," he said. It wasn't a question. I did tracing routes marking possible interference points, highlighting where the plan was tight and where it needed room to breathe. He didn't interrupt, didn't take notes. When I finished, he simply said, "You'll be point on this." Then he left, leaving the tablet and a pen that wasn't mine. I sat there for another minute, feeling the weight of that sentence. Point on this. Not a request, not a test. An assignment. From that moment, the pace increased. Communications came more frequently, though never directly. Everything filtered through layers meant to strip away identity. Still, the signals were clear enough. The initials on the briefs changed from scattered to overlapping. My own appeared first, more often than second. The shift wasn't visible to anyone outside the work. Margaret still saw the same sister she'd grown up overshadowing. The neighbors still thought I kept odd hours for reasons I didn't care to explain. But inside the network, my presence was no longer in question. There was one final detail that told me more than any briefing could. At the end of a long day, I stopped by a secure desk to log out. The clerk, a young man I'd never spoken to, glanced at my ID and then almost under his breath said, "Good to have you back, ma'am." He didn't look up from the screen. He didn't need to. I walked out into the night without replying, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. The sealed bag from my birthday was still in my apartment untouched. I thought about opening it more than once, but each time I stopped. Not yet. The moment hadn't arrived, and some things are stronger when you let them wait. For now, the work was enough. The rhythm, the precision, the trust you can't fake, it was all back in my hands, and I had no intention of letting it go again. Somewhere ahead, I knew there would be a return to that room, to those same faces that had once looked past me. I didn't need to imagine the conversation. I wouldn't have to speak at all. When the time came, my silence would say everything. The return didn't come with fanfare. It never does. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of an email so bland it could have been mistaken for a calendar invite ceremony. Attendance required. No subject line beyond that, no sender name that mattered. The location was familiar, a hall I had been in once before, years ago, when I was still learning how to stand unnoticed in a room full of people who noticed everything. The first time I'd been there, I was one of many. This time, the guest list was smaller, sharper, the kind of gathering where you could trace the hierarchy just by the spaces between the chairs. I arrived early, not so early as to stand out, but enough to choose my ground. The hall was warm with the faint hum of hidden vents. Rows of polished wood chairs faced a dais draped in dark cloth. On the wall behind it, the national flag hung with precise symmetry, the folds ironed flat. The colonel was already there. He stood near the far side of the room, speaking quietly to a man in a gray suit whose posture said more than his clothes did. I didn't interrupt. His eyes met mine briefly, a recognition without smile or nod, and then returned to his conversation. People began to filter in their shoes, muffled against the carpet. I spotted Margaret among them. She wore a fitted navy dress, her hair swept up the kind of polish that belonged on magazine covers. Her expression shifted when she saw me, not surprise exactly, but an unspoken question. "You didn't tell me you'd be here," she said when she reached me. "I didn't know until recently," I replied. She looked as if she wanted to press further, but before she could, the lights dimmed slightly, and a voice from the podium called for everyone to take their seats. I sat in the second row directly in line with the center aisle. Margaret took a seat beside me. I could feel her glance toward the sealed bag. Yes, I had brought it, though I kept it on the floor, partly hidden by my chair leg. The ceremony began the way these things always do: introductions, acknowledgments, words meant to frame the moment without revealing too much. It was when the second speaker stepped up that the air shifted. He was a tall man with close cropped hair and the deliberate calm of someone used to commanding rooms without raising his voice. I recognized him, though we had never spoken directly. He scanned the audience, his gaze resting momentarily on faces I knew carried weight. Then his eyes found me. Certain individuals, he said, serve in ways that cannot be recorded in public ledgers or marked by visible commendations. Yet their impact is felt in the stability we take for granted in the operations that conclude without headlines. The words were careful, almost clinical, but they landed with precision. I felt Margaret's attention sharpen beside me. The man continued. "One such individual is here with us today. Her work, often unseen, has ensured the safety of people she may never meet in places most of us will never stand. She has carried out her duties without expectation of recognition, and in so doing has set a standard for what quiet service can mean." The silence that followed wasn't the empty kind. It was full, like a held breath. He didn't call me to the stage. He didn't need to. The acknowledgement was in the room now, and everyone could see where it had landed. The colonel's eyes were on me. Not a stare, just steady. Margaret looked between us, her expression caught somewhere between confusion and realization. The speaker moved on, the ceremony continued, and the moment folded itself back into the formalities. But the balance in the room had changed. People who hadn't looked my way before now did briefly with the polite curiosity of those trying to fit new information into an old frame. When it ended, the audience stood in small clusters, speaking in low tones. I stayed seated for a while, letting the movement flow around me. Margaret didn't leave my side. Finally, the colonel approached. He didn't greet me the way one might in public. Instead, he stopped just in front of my chair. His voice pitched so low I could feel it more than hear it. "You carried it?" he said. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. He glanced at the sealed bag at my feet, then at me, and for the briefest moment, something like approval flickered in his expression. Then he moved on, engaging another group without a backward look. Margaret bent toward me. "What was that about?" she whispered. "Nothing you need to worry about," I said, my tone even. But I could see she wasn't satisfied. Her eyes tracked the colonel across the room, then came back to me, searching for an explanation I had no intention of giving. It would have been easy to say something to confirm what she suspected, to let the weight of the moment tip in my favor. But I didn't. My silence wasn't a defense anymore. It was a choice. We walked out together, the winter air wrapping around us like a thin blade. Margaret tried again, softer this time. "Abigail, why didn't you tell me I stopped on the steps outside the hall, the sealed bag in my hand?" "Because you didn't need to know," I said. My voice wasn't unkind, but it left no room for reply. For a moment, she stood there as if trying to decide whether to be offended or simply bewildered. Then she nodded almost imperceptibly, and we walked toward the street without another word. Behind us, the hall doors closed, shutting away the warmth and the ceremony, the faces that now carried a different understanding of who I was. I didn't turn back. In some ways, nothing had changed. In others, everything had. and the night air had never felt cleaner. Back in my apartment, the hall's warmth still clung faintly to my coat, but the air was cooler here, quieter. I set the sealed bag on the table and sat across from it, resting my hands on the wood. For months, it had been a silent presence in my home, an unanswered question I had refused to open. Now it felt heavier, as if the weight of the day had settled inside it. I broke the seal slowly. The sound was sharp in the stillness, like tearing cloth. Inside, wrapped in a layer of brown paper, was a flat black case with no markings. I recognized the kind built to be weatherproof, impact-proof, everything-proof. My hands hesitated for a fraction of a second before opening it. The first thing I saw was the patch. It wasn't large, just a circle of dark fabric stitched with a simple emblem, a falcon's head in profile, the eye a thread of silver. Below it, 2 words embroidered in the same muted thread: Silent Aegis. The unit name had never been spoken outside certain rooms, and only a handful of people even knew it existed. Beneath the patch was a small metal bar, its surface etched with my name and a date from years ago, a commendation, but not one that appeared in any official system. You could hold it in your hand and still not find proof of it anywhere but here. Underneath those, in a slim envelope, were 3 photographs. One was of the market square the day everything tilted. In the photo, the crowd looked like a blur of color and motion, but near the center, if you knew where to look, you could see me. The second was of a narrow corridor lined with crates taken from a high angle. The third was of an unremarkable doorway in a building that had since been demolished. Each photo had a small note written on the back in neat block letters marking times, confirming outcomes. At the bottom of the case was a folded sheet of paper heavier than normal stock. I unfolded it carefully. The letter was short, unsigned, printed in the same precise font used for certain internal documents. Monroe, your name was removed from the file. The work remained. Those who needed to know. This is your record. See. I sat back, letting the words settle. It wasn't vindication, not in the public sense. The people who had doubted me, written me off, or ignored my presence in those rooms would still go about their lives believing whatever version of events suited them. This, the patch, the bar, the photographs, the letter, was not for them. It was for me. I traced the edge of the patch with my thumb, remembering the first time I'd seen that falcon in another's hands years ago. Back then, I'd thought I might never earn the right to hold it. Now it was here, not handed to me in ceremony, but delivered in the quiet way that matched the work it represented. I thought of the colonel, his words at the party. That's not a gift. He'd been right. It wasn't. It was a record, a reminder, a tether to a part of myself that no one could erase from the inside out. Margaret's face came to mind, the confusion in her eyes outside the hall, the way she'd looked between me and the colonel as though trying to read a language she'd never learned. She didn't know, and she never would unless I decided to tell her. I wouldn't. Not because she didn't deserve to know, but because this wasn't hers to carry. I put the contents back into the case, closing it with the same care I'd used to open it. Then I placed it in the drawer where I kept the coordinates card and the second sealed envelope from the sedan. All pieces of the same quiet ledger, known to few, owed to no one. That night, I didn't sleep right away. I sat by the window, watching the city's lights shift in the fog, and thought about the way the speaker at the ceremony had described it: work, often unseen. He had been diplomatic. What he meant was work that leaves no trail but the one you carry in your memory. Work that is measured not by who applauds, but by what still stands afterward. The commendation bar's weight in my palm earlier had reminded me of something I'd nearly forgotten a night overseas, the sound of my own breath in my earpiece as I waited for the all clear. The moment it came not from my immediate lead, but from a voice higher in the chain, Monroe, that's clean work. No audience, no follow-up, just the acknowledgement that I had done exactly what was needed exactly when it mattered. That was what the letter meant when it said, "Those who needed to know. And the truth was, I didn't need more than that. By morning, I had locked the case in its place, slipped the key back onto the chain I wore under my shirt, and gone about my day as if nothing had changed. On the surface, nothing had. The people at the corner cafe still called me Miss without remembering my name. Margaret still sent me photos of her dinners. My father still left voicemails that trailed off halfway through. But I carried something now that didn't need to be spoken, a record that couldn't be erased by omission. The next time I saw the Colonel weeks later, it was in passing a corridor exchange with no pause, no words. But as he passed, his hand brushed the edge of the folder he was carrying in a way that told me he knew I had opened the bag. And for the first time in a long while, I felt not just seen, but known. Dawn has a way of making everything honest. The light comes in thin and impartial edging across the sill, touching whatever it finds without preference. I've come to like that first hour. It asks nothing. It simply reveals. I keep my mornings simple. Coffee in a plain mug, a notebook open to a blank page. I've stopped trying to fill every margin with plans. Some days require detail, others only require presence. The work still moves, not loudly, not always in straight lines, and I move with it trusting the rhythm that returns when I listen rather than insist. The case from the sealed bag is where it belongs now, locked and quiet. I don't take it out to reassure myself. I don't need the proof. Knowing it's there is enough a ledger written in objects instead of sentences, an anchor that doesn't show above the waterline. When the city is loud and the day is long, I can feel its weight in the room, even without touching it. It reminds me that value can be real without being visible. I mentor more than I used to. It began by accident, a question in a doorway, a request for a second pair of eyes on a plan, and then became a pattern. The new ones arrive guarded and fast as if speed could compensate for uncertainty. I recognize that instinct. I once wore it like armor. We sit with the maps and the quiet between us. I ask them what they've missed. They always think they've missed something large. Usually it's a seam, a timing, a doorway no one watches because it looks too ordinary to matter. When they see it, their faces change in that small, private way that tells me they'll be fine. I don't tell them about the market or the memo or the way a room can decide what story it wants and leave you to live outside it. I don't need to. The lesson is simpler. Do the work so cleanly that the room's story can't touch it. Take the assignments no one will thank you for and do them without leaving fingerprints. Make it so that when the time comes for a name to be spoken, the only one that makes sense is yours, and if it isn't spoken, the result still stands. Margaret and I talk more now, though the subjects are ordinary. Whether family a new restaurant she likes. The sharpness that used to sit underneath our conversations has dulled not from avoidance, but from acceptance. She doesn't ask about the Colonel anymore. Sometimes she looks at me with a question she can't translate, then chooses something else to say. I let her. She's learning that closeness doesn't require explanation. I'm learning that forgiveness doesn't need an audience. Once at dinner, she reached for my hand across the table and said, "You seem steadier." I laughed and told her I'd finally figured out how much coffee I should drink. We both knew that wasn't it, but we both understood that not everything needs a name. The Colonel appears rarely always in motion. When our paths cross, it happens as if by weather the corridor bends, the elevator arrives. The timing is exact without being deliberate. He asks no questions and gives no orders he doesn't have to. Once, he said only good timing, and that was the whole conversation. It was enough. We are, I think, aligned in our understanding that words can bruise a thing you mean to honor. Silence handled properly can polish it instead. There are still rooms that will never say my name. I no longer measure myself against them. The rooms that matter do not decorate themselves with applause. They are built to bear weight. In those rooms, there is the scrape of chairs, the tap of a pen against a table, a breath taken and held while a line on a map becomes a path on the ground. In those rooms, I am not a roomer. I am the person who points, and others move. On some afternoons, I pass the hall where the ceremony was held. The flag hangs just as it did the drape of the cloth, unchanged by time. People enter and leave in quiet pairs, and I keep walking. Whatever needed to be acknowledged, there has been. Whatever did not, never will. The floor doesn't remember our footsteps. The work doesn't require it to. I have learned to take care of the small things, the lock that sticks, the hinge that sings, the pen that fails when you need a line to be steady. Attention paid at that scale becomes a discipline that holds when the stakes rise. You cannot be precise in crisis if you are careless in calm. So I practice in the ordinary until the extraordinary feels like an extension of it. A younger colleague, sharp reserved eyes that don't miss much, asked me once how you know you're ready. I told her the truth as I understand it: you don't. You only know you're steady. Readiness is a story we tell ourselves on quiet nights. Steadiness is a habit we earn in loud rooms. The calls still come on unmarked channels. The coordinates still arrive without commentary. Sometimes I am second initial. More often now I am first. It doesn't feel like vindication. It feels like alignment, a click into place I can sense in my bones. The past hasn't been rewritten. It has been repurposed the way a scar becomes a seam that holds a thing together. I think sometimes of the man in the wrong jacket of the day the market folded and the story turned sideways. If I could revisit it, I wouldn't change the work. I would change the way I carried the aftermath, not with more words, but with a quieter certainty sooner. That is the gift of hindsight, not a chance to edit, but a chance to steady the hand that carries the next task. Night returns as it always does, and with it, the city's hush broken here and there by a siren or a laugh floating up from the street. I turn off the lamp and listen to the shape of the dark. The case in the drawer is silent. The phone on the table is face down. I am content with both. When the call comes, I will answer. When it doesn't, I will rest. I don't wait by the door anymore. I don't stand at windows and measure my worth by who might walk past. I have people to train lines, to hold maps, to adjust by degrees. No one but me will notice. The work goes on whether or not anyone is clapping, and I go on with it because that is the point, not to be seen, but to make sure what must stand does. If there is a stage left for me, it is a small one, a quiet desk, a page with a route traced thin as a vein, a room where 3 people learn to breathe in unison. I lead there. I serve there, and when the moment ends, it leaves nothing behind but the simple fact that the next moment can begin. Margaret will never know the names of the rooms I enter. The Colonel will never ask for thanks. The ledger will stay folded where it belongs. And I will keep choosing the discipline that built me, the unglamorous patience, the precise mercy, the refusal to spend myself on explanations when execution will do. This is not a life that asks for applause. It asks for integrity. It asks you to carry the hard thing without letting it harden you. It asks you to trust that the right eyes will see and that being seen is not the point. When they did not offer me a seat, I learned the shape of standing. When they forgot to call my name, I learned the weight of answering without it. When the room closed its circle, I measured the perimeter and found there was space enough to work just outside of it, and from there to hold the center steady.